Things are bad here for the economy in Britain. Take a look at Ireland. Today, the Irish Finance Minister Brian Lenihan announced an emergency budget to try to rebuild confidence in the former Celtic Tiger. Irish growth rates were once the envy of the European Union, but now the economy is predicted to shrink by nearly 8% this year, the worst contraction ever recorded. To deal with a budget deficit black hole, the new measures will cut public spending by nearly €1.5 billion for the remainder of the year. But it's not enough. There's more pain to come as the country's tax bill for 2009 climbs by €1.8 billion.
The problem is that our expenditure base is too high and our revenue base is too low. If we fail or refuse or neglect to address this structural problem, we will condemn this generation and future generations to the folly of excessive borrowing. Tax increases are required and they will not be easy to accept, but the measures I am announcing today are progressive. Those who can best afford to pay will pay most. Savings on day-to-day spending will be made through a more targeted welfare provision and further reductions in public service costs and numbers and the wider application of charges. Sharper targeting of programme spending and more efficient use of resources across the board will be required. Difficult decisions in all areas of policy are in prospect and will be taken.
Well, with Alistair Darling planning his own budget here for the end of this month, how different from Ireland are we? Are we also fated to endure a high tax, lower spending, lower growth economy like our neighbour? With me now is the former Conservative Cabinet Minister John Redwood, who chaired his party's recent economic policy review last year. And we're joined from Dublin by the Irish Trades Union representative, Manus O'Riordan. Mr. O'Riordan, first of all, do you accept that Ireland's public finances are in such a mess that the government really had no choice but to do what Mr. Lenihan did today?
The Irish public finances are in difficulty, but not in a mess. I think they're significantly healthier than in the UK. But the Irish Trade Union movement accepted the broad parameters that instead of heading towards a situation where you had borrowing at 12.75% of GDP, you had to bring it back to 10.75%. What we objected to was the actual balance of measures that was taken on the taxation front. We felt there should be more progressivity and more taken from higher incomes and less from lower incomes.
Mr. Redwood, obviously there's huge differences between Britain and Ireland, but you were writing in your blog today about some of the similarities. Where do you see that we are in the same boat, as it were?
Well, I think we're in the same boat as Ireland in that we've got very big banks and the government is standing behind them at enormous expense to the taxpayer. We're in the same boat that we had a massive explosive boom with too much going into property and property prices going crazy, with lots of badly regulated lending against that. And we've been living way beyond our means, as the Irish have. And so I fear we've got a lot of pain and aggro ahead, but it's just that the government is clearly trying to delay it until after the election.
But they have, for example, they're members of the euro, which limits their freedom of manoeuvre. They can't devalue, as we have clearly done one way or another. It's a different kind of economy. Why do you think we're heading the same way?
Well, I think we're very similar, apart from the euro versus sterling. Both governments are now following a course of action to reduce living standards, because they're now saying to people, not admitting they made a full mistake, but they allowed things to get out of hand. We live well beyond our means. Both governments are now saying you've got to cut back. The British government is doing it by devaluation. So when we want to go and buy imports, they're all much dearer. That is cutting our living standards very dramatically now. Ireland is doing it by wage cuts because it joined the euro prematurely. I think it wasn't in balance and in line with Germany. And so the euro actually exaggerated the boom in Ireland, and it's now going to exaggerate the bust.
Mr. O'Riordan, what else could the Irish government have done? You talked about progressivity there. You obviously want more of a burden to fall on the richer people. What about VAT? We, as you know, have cut VAT, or Gordon Brown has, and you've raised it.
Yes, we in the trade union movement criticised that increase as being a very significant mistake, particularly in terms of the cross-border economic alternatives. And it was a mistake to do that. It's also a mistake to, in fact, take too much demand out of the economy, because an attack on living standards knocks the bottom out of consumption, which accounts for 50% of Irish gross domestic product. So that's why we would be opposed to any move towards towards wage cuts on top of what has been taken in taxation. We recognise the need to take taxation, a bigger take from it, but as I said previously, a better balance. But overall, the public finances in Ireland are actually much healthier than in the UK. At the end of this process, in terms of net debt, we will be 55 to 60% of GDP, compared to the Financial Times' prognosis for Britain of 81% in today's issue of the Financial Times.
Well, then, Mr. Redwood, if your party inherits this, would you go down the Irish route? I mean, would you end up having to raise taxes? I know you would say you want to, you aspire to cut them, but would you end up having to raise them as much as 9% on the top earners in Ireland today?
I think that would be quite wrong, because I think if you increase tax rates on enterprise and business and success, you just send a lot of people and a lot of companies abroad, and you reduce your tax base. You obviously need to increase the amount of tax money flowing into the economy. Very often raising rates is the opposite way of doing that.
Well, that leaves you cutting expenditure very severely.
You've got to reduce spending, yes. You've got to do a lot on spending. Now you need.
You're not
the
going to tell us
nurses.
it's all waste, though, are you? Because I mean, what would you actually have to cut?
You're right. I'll tell you. I mean, you need the nurses, teachers, doctors. You want a good health service. You want a good education service in the schools. What you don't need is the unelected regional government. What you don't need is the ID cards. What you don't need are the very large nationalised computer systems. What you can't afford is the massive subsidisation of these very big cuckoo banks that we've taken on board and haven't made them sort themselves out. What you can't afford are the spin doctors, the fat cats, the big expansion of the administration, which we've seen under this government. Hundreds of thousands of extra people not teaching, not helping people in hospitals.
I just wondered whether there's a philosophical difference here between the two of you. And it says, Mr. Reardon, I mean, you see the big problem presumably as unemployment, living standards for the workers that you represent, rather than the public finances